Welcome back to Put the Metal On. My name is Dave Cullen. We're once again back for another metal music review. Today we're going to do a metal review that's not necessarily metal music. It's from Norwegian folk metal band Wardruna, who released their sixth studio album Birna on January 24th of this year. This record dives deeply into the Nordic folklore, centering to the bear's mythological and spiritual significance. The record itself, Birna, translates to she-bear in Old Norse. Now, before we talk about the record itself, obviously, let's talk about the band leading up to the record itself. So before Birna release, Wardruna were firmly established as one of the leading bands in Nordic folk and neo-pagan music. Founded in 2003 by Imar Selvik, aka Keystalvin, the band gained recognition for its use in traditional instruments and deep exploration in Norse culture, ruins, and spirituality. However, despite their well-received recognition and reputation, some signs of creative stagnation began to emerge. The path leading to Birna revealed a reliance on formulaic songwriting rather than innovation. Before we get to that, let's talk about how they built their identity around the Runalud trilogy, a three-album project. This included Gap Var Ginnunga, Yggdrasil, and Ragnarok, which all centered around the Elder Foothook ruins. The trilogy was a huge success, offering Cohesion sonic journey through Norse culture. But however, after Ragnarok, the band seemed a tiny bit lost, in the sense that later releases, such as Skald and Keystalvin, felt more like rehashed themes rather than genuine artistic growth. The spiritual depth that once defined Wardruna began feeling more like branding. Nature, heritage, or ancestral wisdom, once deeply immersive themes, became repetitive slogans. Keystalvin attempted to recapture the magic of Runalud, but ultimately felt like a musical retread with little forward momentum. Wardruna's early work was compelling due to its minimalist yet powerful songwriting, blending rhythmic intensity with primal melodies. But over time, however, this approach became predictable. The percussion became very repetitive, the droning string instruments and chant-like vocals almost turned into a familiar formula. And by the time their latest record, Keystalvin, arrived, it was clear that Wardruna settled into a creative comfort zone. Tracks like Graf, for example, echoed earlier songs, while other songs like Viking didn't really offer any fresh ideas. Also, the band's signature elements, the vocals, the heavy drum patterns, the meditative pacing became a bit overused, making the music feel more like a curated Nordic atmosphere for film or television rather than an evolving artistic expression. I will say that Selvik's commitment to traditional instruments and historical accuracy is very commendable, but as Wardruna's popularity grew, their performances prioritized spectacle over substance. Their visually stunning live shows highlights the dramatic lighting and ceremonial aspects of it, but musically, they expose the band's lack of technical growth. The Tal Harper lines felt predictable, percussion patterns became repetitive, and even Selvik's vocals leaned very heavily on the mystic quality rather than much variation. Even Lindy Faye Hella's vocals are increasingly sublimed as they move further, which was preventing her from contributing more dynamically. Production-wise, they're facing shortcomings too. The production was mostly balanced with an organic raw sound that let traditional instruments shine. But by the time they got to later albums, particularly their last one, it suffered from extensive polish. For example, the once primal frame drum sounded too clinical, with modern production stripping away its raw intensity. Most of all, the overuse of their atmospheric elements such as wind gusts or crackling fires became more of a clutch rather than an actual tool. So instead of using these elements to enhance the songs, it feels like these elements become artificial decoration, masking the compositions falling short. So it's unfortunate because it felt like what was once a very immersive tool for them has now become a very overused trademark for their music. Now, don't get me wrong, their music has played a key role in popularizing Nordic folk, partly due to their work on the Vikings TV series. However, while they may have gained mainstream appeal because of this, their willingness to innovate has diminished as a result. While their peers such as Hellung or Fordom have really pushed the boundaries of unconventional instrumentation and structural risks, it seems like Wardruna have remained stuck in a familiar pattern right now. And while their collaborations for mainstream projects such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla have solidified their reputation, it still has diluted their artistic identity. So going into Birna, it seems that despite their popularity, many listeners begin to recognize that Wardruna are indeed in a creative stagnation. As I mentioned, while their atmospheric qualities are praised, they do lack that innovation. And so longtime fans are wondering now if the band are simply replacing past ideas. So even when the record was announced, while the focus of a bear's life cycle did seem very intriguing, understandably there was some skepticism. Would the album mark a true evolution for Wardruna, or would it just be simply another safe, pleasing release with very real progress? Well, let's find out. Let's first talk about the overall composition and cohesion. So as we mentioned, Birna attempts to fall into a mythological narrative centering around the bear, mirroring the bear's life cycle from hibernization to reawakening. There are tracks like Lost Till Jod and Jod Till Loss symbolize transitions between seasons of state of being. This still feels like the album's flow is a bit disjointed though. The transitions for the tracks, for example, for me lack a very clear emotional bridge, which for me leaves me very unmoved. So it seems like their typical mastery of atmospheric storytelling feels strained here. It's as if the concept didn't want to prioritize natural song progression. The album did very heavily rely on familiar patterns from past records, and while the band did try to introduce variety through tempo shifts and ambient interludes, these efforts come across as forced. Tracks like Jods to Lost basically feels like a replaced idea that came from the Ragnarok records. Several interludes, particularly Wardruna, definitely overstayed its welcome. At nearly 15 minutes, the track tested the patience rather than really enhance any atmosphere for me. Now they do typically excel using silence and subtle shifts to create tension, but here it just feels very indulgent. There's no question the album runs long too, without providing enough dynamic variation. So by the time Hidden Daughter comes, which is a standout track in the album for me, the listener fatigue sets in. Certainly for me it did. And this was due to its repetitive structures and extended ambient passages. For me, it would be way more beneficial if it could have had more focused compositions, but in this case it felt like almost too long, too repetitive. Let's move on to songwriting and arrangements. Now, while some previous albums have had some standout tracks such as Gra, this album for me lacks any comparable hooks or emotional peaks. Now, Stroke Heston tries to offer a rhythmic earworm, but overall the melodies make it seem very forgettable after the first listen. Let's put it this way, it seems like the songwriting is almost on autopilot. It's their signature formula based on percussion, chant-like vocals, and minimalist string lines. And while it's very present, it lacks that creativity as seen in earlier work. Then again, you have tracks like Leifeberg, which builds tension effectively, but it resolves into, again, a very predictable, uninspiring manner for me. And while the album does try to evoke the life cycle of the bear, its emotional range almost feels muted. Most of the tracks really fail to evoke the primal, raw spirit promised by the album's themes. And therefore, it just feels like a collection of songs that feels more like a Nordic folk soundscape rather than a compelling emotional journey. One of Wardruna's strengths, I will say, is their lyrical grounding, particularly with Norse mythology. Unfortunately for Birna, the lyrics do feel like more like placeholders. The metaphors surrounding hibernation and reawakening are definitely present, but they lack that depth. Lines that should carry mythic weight instead feel repetitive and over-reliant on past tropes. Now let's talk about the performance and musicianship. Now technically the band perform very well, but again, the performances lack that vigor and authenticity from their earlier albums for me. The string work in particular feels less dynamic and more mechanical than their previous releases. The percussion remains solid, but it doesn't evolve into anything beyond familiar patterns either. Now, Wardruna have always balanced technicality with emotional authenticity very well, while maintaining a very good, authentic and expressive feel, but in this case the performances still feel rigid. The organic energy that has characterized the Runalad's trilogy is replaced with a clinical precision that strips away a lot of the music's soul. Of course, Selvig's vocals remain a strong point, but the delivery sounds more cautious rather than commanding on this occasion. Tracks like Himmendatter lack that guttural intensity needed to really convey the bear's strength like they're trying to portray. And as I feared, Lindy Hay Halla's vocals, while technically flawless, are just very underutilized and often relegated to background layers. I feel if her vocals were more present or more utilized, it could have given a lot more depth to the record. The drum work has retained its earthy punch, but it still suffers from a lack of innovation, like a lot of the musicianship here. The interplay between the percussion and the low-end strings remain functional but uninspiring, making it difficult, certainly for me, to distinguish one track's rhythmical foundation from another. The interplay between the percussion and low-end strings remains functional but uninspiring. Therefore, it makes it difficult for me to distinguish one track's rhythm from another, really. Let's move on now to the production and sound quality of the album. The production remains very crisp, very clear, allowing every instrument to be heard without overpowering others. I also think its clarity occasionally works against the music's intended atmosphere. It diminishes the rawness necessary to invoke the primal wilderness or spiritual transformation, which I think is what they want us to do for this record. The tones of the strings, for example, are so polished to the point where it sounds bland. Wardruna have typically thrived on the gritty textures of their traditional instruments, but in this case I just felt that the lyre and the telharpa feel overly processed and therefore losing that organic bite that I think which really makes them stand out. The percussion does hit very hard, but it lacks that variation in timbre and dynamics. Plus the repetitive thud of the frame drums just grows very tiresome by the album's midpoint. Vocally, it's very well balanced, but it lacks that commanding presence expected for a narrative-driven album like this is intended to be. And as I mentioned to you before, in terms of effects like the wind and the crackling fire and even the distant animal calls, it feels excessive at times. So rather than really enhancing the music, it just feels predictable and quite frankly distracting. This brings us on to the creativity and originality of the record. Now, while Wardruna have carved out a decent niche for Nordic folk, it feels like an album made to satisfy genre expectations rather than to push artistic boundaries. Their reliance on established patterns and sounds suggests a creative plateau for me. Of course, the album honors its influences while forging its own sound. It balances respect for tradition and creative exploration, there's no question about that. But as I said so many times, the band continues to draw heavily from its earlier work. It feels less like an expression of new ideas and more like a retread of past successes. At least they remain firmly within their established sonic territory, which, some fans can say at least they're consistent. But for me, the lack of experimentation here makes it feel very static and less adventurous from their previous releases. This brings us on finally to our replay value and impact. For me, the immersive quality diminishes after listening to this a few times. For me, the intrigue of the record gives way to frustration, quite frankly, particularly with the lack of standout moments. There are some tracks that give some brief glamours of vitality, such as Shrughasten and Fly Viaberg, but these tracks still pale in comparison to their past records. And while the record is undoubtedly resonant within niche folk and neo-pagan circles, it still lacks a crossover appeal that, as I've said so many times, has made their earlier works just so impactful. To conclude, I just feel Being It is an album that really struggles under the weights of its own ambition. While the foundation still remains intriguing, the execution itself doesn't live up to it. Wardruna have definitely proven themselves as masters of atmosphere and narrative in the past, but here it feels like they're just replacing familiar motifs without offering any new insights or experiences. If you're a long-term fan, this is definitely an album they can definitely lean to for comfort, but if you're seeking progression and innovation, I'm afraid Being It is more like a slumber rather than a reawakening. And that's another review. This one was a bit different now. This is the first time I've done something, you could say it's close to the metal scene, but at the same time it's very different from something before. It was a hard one for me to do in terms of its detail, but nevertheless, please leave your comments below. What did you think? Did you agree or disagree with me? What do you think of all the atmosphere? Do you think they tried to fulfill with their theme? Please let us know. If you liked the video, as always, give us a like, and for more videos, please give us a subscribe. We'll be back soon with some more metal music reviews. So until then, I've been Dave Cullen, and this has been Put the Metal On. Stay safe and enjoy the metal.